you all for joining us. Welcome to the Rock Center Online at Stanford Law School. It's my pleasure to have you join us today. My name is Mike Callahan. I'm the Executive Director of the Rock Center for Corporate Governance here at Stanford Law School. Before I introduce our guests and we get started, just a couple of logistics items. First, this session is being recorded, as you were just notified and when you were informed when you signed in. We will do about 30 minutes or so of discussion with our distinguished guest speakers, and then we'll open it up to audience Q&A. Please use the Q&A function in the Zoom app at the bottom of your screen. Type your questions there. I will moderate the Q&A queue from here. And we do really encourage audience questions, and we'll leave 15 minutes or so at the end for that. So please have your questions ready to go. Now I'd like to introduce our guests. First, Crystal Jezierski is the former Senior Vice President of Global Ethics at Walmart, which position she held until April of this year. Prior to Walmart, Crystal was a partner with global law firm Baker McKenzie, where she focused on compliance, investigations, and government enforcement. Prior to her time in private practice, Crystal spent several years in public service in senior positions at the Department of Justice, including Deputy Assistant Attorney General, as well as the Director of the Office of Intergovernmental and Public Liaison, as well as time on Capitol Hill as the Chief Counsel for Oversight and Investigations at the House Judiciary Committee. Welcome, Crystal. We're so delighted you could be with us today from DC.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Amyn Thawer, my former colleague, is the Vice President, Global Compliance and Integrity at LinkedIn, where in addition to compliance programs and investigations, his team is responsible for enterprise risk management and managing internal audit engagements. Prior to LinkedIn, Amyn served at eBay as the Business Ethics Officer for eBay's stable of e-commerce and payments properties, including PayPal, as well as holding other roles within the eBay legal department, including head of legal for eBay Canada. Prior to moving in-house, Amyn worked as a corporate and securities attorney with Wilson Sonsini in Palo Alto, California, and the Canadian law firm of Stikeman Elliott. Amyn, it's great to see you. Thank you for taking the time to be with us as well.
Great to be here.
Okay, so why don't we start at a high level, and Crystal, I'd like to start with you, which is the challenges from this pandemic from an ethics and compliance perspective are many, and thinking about omni-channel retailers like Walmart, they have a frontline worker presence. You have supply chain issues. You have emergency components and essential services, as well as a suite of knowledge workers. And so as you think about the high-level challenges presented here, what sort of policies need to be addressed and what priorities are emerging for the function, for the ethics and compliance function?
Yeah, so I think, I think when you're, first of all, I think when you're looking at this for any company, at the end of the day, it's the usual challenges you have in ethics and compliance, which is how well do you understand how the business does what it does? So in this circumstance, at the end of the day, you've got to understand what the business was doing and how it operated beforehand and how the pandemic has changed how it's had to operate so that you can then understand how you need to change what you do. And to a certain extent, this winds up being an interesting assessment of how well you originally understood what the business was doing in the first place. But once you kind of get that and move on from that, when you're looking at these larger essential retailers like Walmart, Amazon, when you look at it's got Whole Foods and Target and just these other retailers that have those essential goods and services that that the public has needed now. I think in my mind I approach it sort of from this dual challenge of looking at the changes that the operators have had to make in order to continue serving customers. And then what do I need to do with that part of the program? But then there's this other part, which is just everything else. How do you handle the rest of your business, the functions that support your operations? And so I think, when you're looking at the operational side, obviously your first priority and your main priority is protecting your frontline workers, protecting those workers in the stores, but then also just as much as you're protecting those customers. And with respect to the customers, you're also trying to protect them in a way that minimizes the friction that they have to bear so that you are continuing to ensure everyone that they're being protected. You're also inspiring confidence in your customers that you're taking the right steps to protect them and to protect your workers, who in many instances are also their friends and family members as well. And so really, just thinking about what that looks like, especially with this pandemic, which is a physical issue. It's manifesting itself physically. So, what we know about the science so far, it's figuring out everything from what do I need to do to protect everyone from a prevention standpoint? So, are we testing? How are we testing? How are we keeping track of the testing that we're doing? How are we managing that data and information about the testing that's being done? What about contract tracing? I think the entire country is still figuring out how to do that. But for companies the size of Walmart and other larger retailers like that, that's going to be a large endeavor. Do you need more people to do this? What kind of systems do you need? And that's just on the prevention side. When you think about once you find out whether or not someone has been exposed, how do you then contact all of the people that need to be contacted? How do you decide who needs to be contacted? How far does the exposure bubble go? Does it go to just the person who works there? If someone in their household is exposed to someone else, like how do you draw those lines? And then once you find out that someone has contracted it, what types of leave and benefits, what does that all look like? And then how do you bring them back? So, there's this whole kind of healthcare related / employee compliance bucket that you really need to kind of write a new handbook on in terms of how to handle it right now in a context that is just, it's so dynamic, and we don't know. Well, I think we'll find out that we obviously know a lot more about this now than we did 2 months ago, but in 5 months, this still may be barely 10% of what we know right now. So, it's just really trying to keep track of those things. I think the other thing to think about when you're dealing with this as well is there's a lot of different aspects to this, but there's the childcare and family and schooling aspect of this also, how that plays into things like leave, because I think as this has evolved, and even just things that I'm hearing, that's another piece that's really going to dictate how your employees can come to work.
Yeah, when you think about that ecosystem that you mentioned with employees, customers, families, and the profile of companies like a Walmart and others, it's an incredibly complicated landscape. Amyn, I wanted to get your perspective, because LinkedIn has a workforce that conceivably could be remote for a long time, or at least large components of it could. And so where are you seeing pressure on the framework of a corporation's relationship with employees that's traditionally been done a certain way? And where do you see things changing and how you see your work?
I think you accurately characterize it as a big shift in terms of how we think about our workforce. And so for a company like ours, which has always been an office culture, we have to ensure that our policies are applicable to a workforce that wants to work from anywhere. So this has all sorts of implications: comp and ben, tax, payroll, permanent establishment issues in terms of where your employees are situated for tax purposes. All those things come into play. There's information security, privacy, and these are just a few. So when we think about it from a compliance lens, all of these policies will need to be revisited from a remote from work perspective.
And are there, as you look across the organization, and you mentioned a few different areas that would need to change, from your standpoint and being responsible for compliance and ethics, are there certain areas within the organization that you would advise your colleagues that present possible hotspots where problems could pop up?
Sure. I think, Mike, I think the organization that's really on the front lines and impacted in a software company or a tech company is really the sales org. The pressures on the sales org are enormous. On the one hand, they're struggling to meet their numbers and hit their quotas in a tough economic environment. On the other hand, they're trying to do what's best for their customers, see their customers through this difficult time. And so those twin pressures are really challenging. And so if I was to advise colleagues, it would be to figure out how we can best support, guide our sales teams through this tough time, because it is really challenging.
Mm-hmm. And that challenge of trying to return things back to normal, even though we all know it won't be the normal we used to know, but a new normal of the workplace. Crystal, I'd love to get your thoughts on as people come back to work. So it's been a patchwork of certain states, certain countries are starting to reopen at different stages and in different ways. And even here in California, we have a revised shelter order between different counties, and I'm sure the same in many states. What are some of the areas that the compliance and ethics organization should be thinking about, advising the organization on as there starts to be more pressure and more safety in bringing people back to work?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is just realizing and understanding that there's never, I don't think that we're going to sort of go back and have a moment when we all go back to the office and it's the way that we remember it beforehand. I think it's going to be more of an evolution, and it's going to be a constant evolution of different, just different approaches as employees get comfortable and as employers get comfortable with what they can offer their employees and how they can keep them safe. And so I think it's going to be just sort of a continual kind of dynamic taking in of information and adjusting as literally the days and the weeks go on. And so I think, I think that's the first starting point. And then the second aspect of this that I think is just as important is that the longer people are working remotely, then I think you're going to start to see companies make determinations that certain functions are they lend themselves to remote working, or they do not require being in an office. And so I think one of the things that ethics and compliance and that really the whole all part of the company need to be prepared to do is really starting to look now at, are there any functions, any areas where either their productivity has changed or been impacted, or that where you cannot do things like push down the technology or push down the software that is necessary to support that work, such that they need to be in the office. And so I think that's where you really see an impact on compliance, because depending on your industry, there's some industries where what you're doing as an employee is constantly monitored. So can you push that down? If people are logging into your system via their laptop at home that their 8-year-old is doing things on in the morning, or not. And can you, and separate from that, you have other compliance functions where, they're monitoring activity. And so can you push that software down? And how can you protect the data? What does encryption look like? And so what are these issues as they relate to your industry, to your company, your business model in particular, and how do you work through those? And at the end of the day, if you can find a solution to some of these and you put that next to what the cost for square footage commercially is in whatever city you are, I think any company would be remiss, especially with the pressures on revenue and profit right now, to not look at that and make determinations. And I think, you saw when you look at companies like Facebook, which just recently announced long-term that they're going to move a certain percentage of their workforce to being a remote workforce within 5 years, and then more so in 10 years. I just think that there's this, it's accelerated a movement that I think was already afoot. I think the other thing, which I touched on a little bit earlier at the beginning, is again, just this issue with respect to family care and childcare and education around families. And so as that impacts how your employees are able to work for you, then it's thinking more broadly about how they can contribute and when they can contribute. And then you've got the compliance issues around, again, how do you facilitate that? How do you, protect the integrity of what they're doing, and, et cetera, so that they can continue to contribute. But, families are making a lot of hard decisions right now about what they're going to have to do with their children. And I'm hearing just anecdotally here in my network, I'm hearing a lot of people with younger children who have accepted that they probably won't be sending their kids to daycare or to school, at least probably through the end of this year. So really having the tools that are needed to support those workers if they aren't going to be able to physically come into the office. I think one other quick point too, and this is
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to add the final one of just health status and privacy, and how you have the conversation with your employees about what their health is. Because again, until we get a vaccine, I think a lot of people are going to be concerned about what they walk back into. And so both companies and employees are going to have to get more comfortable with some level of greater visibility into employee health status. And I think on both sides, you're going to have kind of a conversation and a bargain and a negotiation about, if you're going to take my temperature, and there are many different reasons why I may have a temperature, what information do I feel comfortable giving you so that you know that my temperature is not because of COVID? You know, and how do you have that conversation? And what types of things can you do to assure your employer that you're okay to return? And what do you feel comfortable doing as an employee?
So Mike, just to add to that, I think the key that Crystal is pointing out is that we need to strike the right balance here between protecting individual rights and freedoms and safeguarding public health and, making a remote workplace function with productivity. And so the other thing I think about is that maybe these solutions are also different depending on the geography. Around the world, there are different laws and regs that we have to follow. So the way we operate may be shaped very differently in different contexts. So it's definitely something that we're thinking about, and it's a challenge. But privacy issues are going to be amongst the most difficult ones that we're going to have to address. Oh, looks.
Yeah, I think so. I agree. Can you guys hear me? Okay, I think I lagged out a little bit there. You back? Yeah, good, great. Well, that transition is something I wanted to get to, Amyn, which was when we think about the issues of the workplace and how it's changing as people come back to work. The pandemic has forced everybody to rely on tech tools in a way that they haven't before. And I'd love to get your perspective on how accessibility will change in terms of innovation or broader adoption of accessible tools as an inclusive way to bring more people together. And I know you and LinkedIn have done a lot of work on accessibility, but how do we think this pandemic will impact that for the positive or present more challenges?
Yeah. So Mike, this crisis does present us with an opportunity. As you know, people with disabilities suffer twice the rate of unemployment or underemployment than the average. And so in some ways, remote work actually removes one of the key barriers to economic inclusion. So that, though, is dependent on the fact that there are tools available that help them work remotely. And so I think tech companies actually have a bit of catch up to do with regard to making their tools, their solutions accessible and free from bias and other barriers so that we can support economic inclusion. And just looking around, we have a host of issues around inequality in the country that we're facing. And so this might be an opportunity for us to think about that more deeply, think about what inclusion means in a virtual context. So I'm both optimistic and a little bit nervous about it. I think the last thing I would add is that, compliance role is really to provide that oversight to make sure things get done.
Yeah, Crystal, I'd love to get your perspective on this too. Like how should strategies be deployed to address some of the risks that Amyn was mentioning in terms of?
Yeah, I think, I think an important aspect to this as well is culture. And so when you think about inclusion, you think about other issues such as diversity, and honestly, you think about, just a company's, more broadly, a company's ethics program as a whole. So much of how a company operates, whether it's ethics and compliance or just how you go about getting your sales, if you're LinkedIn, who you are and what you do, it all comes back to this underlying culture and tone that is set. And I think, honestly, there are going to be some challenges that companies are going to have and that companies as a whole are going to have to work through when it comes to how do you promote these things when you don't have physical proximity. And so much of setting a tone and who you are and what you do is communicated non-verbally, or it's communicated physically, it's communicated in what you see when you walk into a workspace. So I think, companies are going to have to be very intentional about what you communicate and the frequency of your communication, who you're communicating with, how you do it, one-on-one, large events, one-on-one versus large events. How do you as a manager manage your people in the middle in between those things so that you can be kind of the glue that pushes down and holds up those cultural issues, whether they're diversity, inclusion, or things like harassment, just any type of issue that really sort of has that culture at sort of its foundation in terms of what people are doing and how. I think also it's going to require companies to understand what does success look like in these areas, because you're going to have to be very direct and look for different ways of getting results. So I think sometimes you tend to see, or this is just my feeling, that some companies will over rely on things like events and affiliative types of things to promote inclusion and culture and such. And when you don't have that, then you've got to really kind of think about, so what am I actually going for, and how do I message this, and then who's my audience, and then how do I, at the end of the day, look back at what we've done in the last year and determine that we've made progress.
Yeah, the culture point, I think, is critical. Amyn, do you want to weigh in a little bit on what you're thinking about in terms of strategies on culture?
Yeah, so it's, as Crystal mentions, we have to pay attention to culture at this time. It really is the glue that binds a company together. And if done right, it can really be a competitive advantage, especially going through a downturn. The truth is that these physical offices that we have, they naturally serve as a magnet to attract people and foster that sense of community. And that's been taken away. And so we have to find what that public square looks like in the virtual world. And so I think for us, it's really a time to over communicate, and where compliance and ethics has really got to be plugged into the comms team, has a voice in influencing messaging and the tone from the top that's being set.
Yeah.
And so, there's just some tactical things that we should be doing as compliance officers. We should let our employees know that there are listening mechanisms for them. They can feel comfortable speaking out, even though they may feel like they're in isolation. The whistleblower helplines. I think companies are already doing this, but if you haven't, pulsing your employees way more frequently to assess their well-being. I think companies are taking a bigger role in assessing employee well-being than they ever have before. That includes mental well-being. We're all under stress. I think management also needs to reinforce expectation around the values that a company has, and ensure that they endure even though we're scrambling to stabilize our businesses. And so our employees are expecting the companies to lead with compassion. And we need to make sure that our culture kind of lives up to the billing. So I think focusing on culture is critical, and culture and ethics are so intertwined. There's definitely a role for ethics officers to play in helping steer that culture the right way.
Yeah, that obviously critical and even more challenging these days, and recent events, I think, make some of that even more challenging, I think, for companies, and important to keep that top of mind. I want to shift gears a little bit. Much of our audience at the Rock Center are board members, advisors to board members. And then maybe we could start with you, and Crystal, I'd love to get your view too. Where do you see audit committees and boards focused on right now as we've confronted the initial wave of the pandemic and how things move forward? What are some areas that are hot that are being looked at?
Yeah, there's a few things I would point out. I think audit committees should really be concerned about the resiliencies of their control infrastructure, both financial and security. As people work remotely, what are the implications on that control infrastructure? They should be assessing like the company's agility and business continuity. How successful were they in navigating this? I think Crystal pointed out this might be the first wave, right? There might be other roadblocks, and so we should take these learnings and figure out how resilient we can be for future obstacles. And I think that all points to how well a company is at risk management as well. Have we been able to detect through our risk management processes, these types of risks that are surfacing. If I was the board, I would be pressing management to talk about what contingencies they have in place to both identify those risks that are emerging and then address those risks as we continue to be in quarantine. You know, I don't think any company imagined that we would have a global shutdown. And now that we've experienced it, you know, there's got to be learnings and weaknesses that we can shore up in this interim period.
Crystal, something to add there?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Amyn said. One thing that I would add that we haven't really talked about a lot yet is COVID is changing it's going to change the business model of a lot of companies. And for some companies, they're probably, or they should be asking, has our why changed? You know, what is the purpose of, you know, companies will always have a purpose for being created. And I think they have to look at how that purpose may have changed based on how, based on the changes we're seeing in terms of how people are living, how we're coming together as a community and as a society. And so, you know, as companies and as leadership at companies, and really sort of as the board kind of thinks about those things with its top level executive leadership, you know, some are going to change their business models, things that they were investing in, they're not going to be focused on those things anymore. Maybe that's long-term, medium-term, maybe that's permanent. Some companies may entirely change what they're doing and apply their fundamental thesis to a totally different human scenario than the one that drove them to form in the first place. So really just kind of thinking about those big questions and those big issues, I think that, you know, they're definitely conversations that have to happen. And some may change a lot, some may not change at all. I think the other big piece of this as well is just sort of picking up on Amyn's risk management comment is, I think that companies will have to be much more forward-leaning in terms of thinking about what might the world look like in 5 years? And I don't know that all companies are really thinking that way. What might the world look like in 10 years? And there's opportunity in thinking this way. I mean, just putting aside ethics and compliance, I mean, that tells you how will your product sell in 10 years if you can accurately predict what society is going to need in 10 years. But I think also just taking more ownership though, and really being more proactive in terms of tracking, you know, geopolitical things, health related things, demographic related changes and impacts, so that you can better understand for yourself and not have to rely on other institutions to tell you when something bad is happening. Because I think companies are actually in a pretty good position to figure that out themselves, at least a lot of the larger ones, because you're the ones interacting with people. You know, you're seeing how people shop, you see what they buy, or, you know, for LinkedIn, you understand which industries are hiring, which ones may not. Like, you know, you've got a window into the world that I think government institutions can't really have. And so, you know, I think taking on that leadership role is going to be an important thing for companies to do for themselves. And then it's an offering that they can also provide to their community as well.
I think that is a great perspective and a great segue to the last question that I have, and I'll throw it to the audience now. If you'd like to please use the Q&A tab, we can turn to your questions in a moment, which is, Crystal, the idea of a role of a corporation in society. And you just started to talk a little bit about how the inputs that corporate America has are pretty powerful, and also how they can understand their dynamic. But when you think about the impact that a large employer like a Walmart or others have on the community around them, they're one of the largest private employers in terms of supply chain, their essential services that they're providing to the community. And we have this debate that came back in August of last year after the Business Roundtable announced the restatement of the purpose of a corporation to include communities and employees and environment in a more explicit way in corporate decision making. I'd love to get both of your thoughts on that. Like, how do we think about the role of a corporation in society coming out of this pandemic and all of the different ways that corporations like LinkedIn and others can play a role?
I think, you know, as you think about larger global companies, again, just the scale that you can offer just your size drives certain activities, and it drives the development of certain, again, if you're looking at retailers, it can drive the development of certain products and services and goods. And so again, if you're thinking very broadly and very proactively about what the future might look like, there's an opportunity there as you're trying to protect your workforce and protect your customers and provide offerings to your customers, to also really drive providing goods, from a sort of philosophically, good things to the community, and really be a force for positivity, a force for things that help communities prevent, what you're seeing. And to me, that's when you think about the opportunity there, that's the opportunity, is that you really have an opportunity to be the leader in the front line on that. And being a good community citizen helps you also in being a good business and a good corporate citizen.
So makes sense. Amyn, you want to talk about LinkedIn's unique position here?
Yeah, look, I think stakeholder capitalism has really come into sharp focus, and companies are embracing that role, especially since they've had to sometimes step in and fill the gaps that government has provided in the past, and so there's more being expected of companies today. Information is disseminated so quickly, but I think all this has done is really just accelerated a number of paradigm shifts. And so, LinkedIn, our vision and our mission as a company of creating economic opportunity for everyone is really, really important in this context. And so rather than thinking about how our business model changes, we're really thinking about, okay, well, how do we address our vision and mission in this context? And so what we're seeing in terms of trends that impact our business are really fascinating. This notion of virtual communities, doing stuff remotely, social media to create community is important. We're looking at how global workforces are being impacted. We don't need to cluster our employees in one geo-locale. In fact, our risk profile is worse if they're concentrated. So we're thinking about what that means to our business and what that means to the labor force. And for us, what we're trying to see is, okay, how do we leverage our assets to be of service to governments in terms of mapping the labor markets, understanding where there are gaps and mismatches between skilled labor and the needs of employers. And so there's a ton of opportunity there. And the challenge really is to cut through the noise and kind of the hysteria right now, to reach the right decision makers, to make progress in a constructive way with not only our domestic government here in the US, but with governments around the world, because this is a global problem, and we have the tools and capabilities as a global player to really make a difference and have insights that no one else has. And so our responsibility really is to share that insight and make some constructive suggestions on how we can better impact the labor force.
That's a great perspective, and I do think this pandemic already, there were challenges in terms of how global companies operate, but now with companies, to both your points, playing such a forward role in helping communities recover in so many different ways, it's a fascinating time to be readdressing the stakeholder capitalism and broader inclusion model that you both mentioned. So let's turn to audience Q&A. The first question we have is, how do you think about doing investigations in the COVID and remote work environment? So maybe, I don't know, Crystal, if you want to start, and then I'll follow up if you have additional things to add.
Yeah, I mean, how you conduct investigations is always a risk-based analysis. And to that extent, sometimes it's fact-based as well. And so I think in this context, you're looking at where you draw the line between what needs to happen in person versus what can happen virtually. Social distancing doesn't mean that we don't ever see people. And, I think, there are certain circumstances where, based on what the company may be facing, you do need to find a way to do some things physically. But otherwise, I think you need to look at and utilize all of the communication tools that you have. I think the challenge with investigations, particularly when you're doing interviews, is that you do sort of need those cues at times, and it's very challenging to do high stakes investigations without being around people. And so I think, you know, as the company, you just need to determine what those high stakes things are and make the analysis as to when, you know, in-person interviewing type things need to occur. But I think, and Amyn touched upon this earlier in the conversation, this is the time where you actually, I think you need to be, you almost need to overcompensate in terms of how you monitor your investigations, how you manage them, and how you just how you watch them as they go forward, because there's a lot of increased risk in terms of getting results. You know, traditional ways of working have gone away. So when you look at things like supply chain, or for LinkedIn, you know, sales, as Amyn mentioned, you know, there's a lot of pressure on the bottom line right now, and people are having to do things in a new way. And you aren't in the office where people have many traditional ways of communicating concern. So, you know, that over communication piece, you know, I think it not only goes towards making sure that people understand all the avenues that they have, but I think it also goes towards how you're managing each investigation and how you're communicating with the people that are involved in the investigations, including your witnesses, so that you can just ensure that you are not missing anything.
Yeah. So just one tactical thing on the investigations front, you know, the video conferencing has really been super useful to break down some of those challenges when trying to do live interviews and kind of getting cues from body language. So that's been super helpful. I think the one other thing just to point out is I think we as investigators in the compliance domain also need to have a lot of compassion as we do these investigations in this time. There are a lot of stresses on employees. It doesn't mean that we don't execute on those investigations and there are no corrective actions that we take, but we have to be that much more sensitive because of the prevailing winds here. People are in a fragile state, and we need to respect that and understand that as we conduct these investigations. So I think we've been trying to be much more attentive and sympathetic in discharging those investigations. So it's a good learning for us.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there's also, you need to have a good partnership with the operators and the business so that you can do what you need to do in a way that is that's not unnecessarily disruptive. That's not to say that you don't go forward with what you need to do, but you need to realize where we are and that a lot has changed and that a lot of people are trying to get their hands around a new environment that, you know, it's just not that comfortable to be quite frank about it. The other thing that I think is worth mentioning as well is I think that this is also the time to really very proactively be in communication with your front line and your people that you know are under the most pressure from, not from an investigative perspective, but just from a touch base, town hall, call it what you want, but just sort of a very regular check-in, even sometimes if it's weekly, just to say, hey, what are you seeing? Like in the retail context, it would be, what are you seeing on the floor? How's everyone feeling? How are you doing? Just kind of getting everyone's temperature so that you can also start to just feel out how people are doing and where you might or might not have issues. And that also honestly helps you just from the pure business perspective to understand where you might have leadership or management changes or where things just aren't connecting the way that they should versus those that really are connecting as well.
Mm-hmm. Those practical tips are great. And we have a second question from the audience along the same lines, which is, and Amyn, perhaps you tackle this one first. While battling this pandemic, are there new and innovative things that an ethics and compliance team should do to engage and influence the work from home workforce and the managers that work with those teams?
It's a great question. I'd also be open to suggestion on that one, but a practical thing is just to remember that you can't build new policies in a vacuum. And so what you have to do is take great pains to reach out to all your stakeholders. And I found it really valuable in this period now because at first when we looked at how to work remotely, we didn't quite fathom, the childcare issues or the other issues that sprung up from a remote work life. And so our policies were missing things. And so because people are experiencing this crisis in different ways, it's really important that you canvass their feedback and input before you build your policies, because it's really tough to go back and rewrite policies based on all the inputs you get after the fact. So that would be my one tip, is just make sure that you are socializing your revisions to policies to a broader audience than ever before, because the unintended consequences of what you're doing are tough to detect if you don't have that on the ground analysis from your workforce.
That's good advice. Crystal, anything to add there?
No, I agree with that. And I think that's kind of consistent with just having that connectivity with everyone, and kind of the over communication and making sure that you understand how everyone is experiencing what's going on, and incorporating that into not just your policies and procedures, but also kind of your larger conversation of culture and how you can most effectively impact and maintain and change or improve your culture component.
Get it? And this theme of sort of uncertainties and unexpected events, I wanted to ask one or both of you, whoever would like to jump in, is in terms of downstream effects and externalities, the pandemic, it's produced or exacerbated other challenging situations, trade war with China, or geopolitical issues, and just the core travel disruptions that we're seeing. Economic inequality was something that was an important issue for many companies and compliance and ethics teams, and that's starting to be exacerbated even more so in the wake of the pandemic. What do you guys see as some of the most concerning challenges from the compliance and ethics standpoint as we address this pandemic in these external areas?
Yeah, I think the one thing I'd point out is that, and I think you said this, Mike, there's this patchwork of return to work and different policies around the globe that we have to manage. And it is quite overwhelming to see, on a county by county basis, how policies are emerging. And so I think that is really tough to manage. And then I think for us as US-based companies, trying to understand what is going on in other parts of the globe is very challenging as well. I have to admit that, back in January when this was surfacing in China, we just thought it was a little blip on the radar. We weren't really diving deep and understanding what was going on. And so just trying to avoid that tunnel vision that you have based in the US is tough. But I think the bigger question for me is, how do we get back to normal? And from an ethics point of view, I think we should be reevaluating and kind of reformulating what normal should be, and how we operate in a world where tensions between globalism and nationalism are really peaking. And so that's really, I think from an ethics standpoint and even a compliance standpoint, you mentioned the trade issues that surface as a result. Mm-hmm. That's really what's going to preoccupy us in terms of navigation of this new world.
Yeah, I completely agree with all of that. I think, we've companies set up as global companies, sort of all different components are throughout the world. And we have these, we have the pandemic right now, which has isolated people within their countries. But even before then, we had Brexit. We had a lot of nationalistic movements and thoughts and philosophies taking hold. And so how do you have a global company in this context, and figuring out what you have to change operationally, and then how that impacts compliance, when at a time, at one point it seemed like a lot of compliance and ethics standards were going towards a more, one kind of, not standard, but you could sort of talk to everyone regardless of country about them. And I think we're moving away from that a bit. because of the patchwork. So it's just figuring out how you manage that.
That's terrific. I want to wrap up here in interest of everybody's time. I want to thank Crystal and Amyn for taking the time to be with us to share your insights, experience, and perspective. This is great and terrifically valuable. So thank you very much for joining us. And I'd also like to thank our audience for taking the time to be here. And I hope that you will join one of our Rock Center online episodes in the future. And I hope everybody has a great day. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.